Right, I think we'll begin. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are logging in and different parts of the world. And welcome to the ESG webinar. It's the first in the series of our webinars. The series have been inspired by Impacts. Impacts is Savills' flagship global thought-led research publication that comes out annually. This ESG webinar is also supported by a regional ESG release, which came out at the beginning of this week, which you all have access to on our website, and will be sent the report after the webinar as well, so you can read up on that. A big thanks to Swapnil Pillai, who put that together and has been instrumental in arranging this ESG webinar as well. There will be, as I said, this is a series of events. We hope you enjoy this session, but we also hope that you can join us for an ongoing series of events. So later on next month, we'll be focusing on resilient cities around the world and in the region. And then later on in November, in association with Expo 2020, we'll be discussing the future of work. This will be a webinar, but it will also be a live event. There will be an opportunity to actually see you in person, so hopefully you can come to that as well. Right, enough from me. I think we should get cracking on the webinar and the subject matter. So I'd like to pass over to Sophie Chick, who is our head of world research, based in London. She's been instrumental in the Impacts publication, and I know ESG as a subject matter and as a sector is very close to her heart. So it's great to have you on, Sophie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. So I'm just going to give you a quick 5-minute presentation, setting the scene on ESG and real estate before we get stuck into the panel session. So let's start with the E of ESG. It's the obvious place to start, environment, and this definitely still gets the most headlines. And it's easy to see why that is when we have a look at global carbon emissions. So in 2020, global carbon emissions declined by 5.8%, the largest ever decline due to the pandemic, and almost 5 times greater the 2009 decline that followed the global financial crisis. But despite that decline, 2020 also saw the highest ever concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, around 50% higher than when the Industrial Revolution began. And really importantly, this year, global carbon emissions are forecast to rebound and grow by 4.8% as demand for coal, oil and gas rebound with the economy. So this means global emissions will be just 1.2% below that 2019 peak. So there is still a lot of work to do. And I think we are also seeing, particularly this summer, that climate change is happening now. This is not a challenge of the future. This summer, we've seen extreme heat waves, droughts, wildfires like the one shown in this photo in Turkey, and there's also been severe flooding. And if it feels like these extreme weather events are increasing, that's because they definitely are, as you can see on this chart. So starting over on the left-hand side in 1980, there were just over 200 climate-related extreme weather events per year. That compares to nearly 4 times that number in the most recent years. And of course, this is very relevant to the Middle East. Over the summer, many countries have recorded temperatures of over 50 degrees and up to 53 degrees in Kuwait. And many of the region's cities are also located on the coast, so rising sea levels can also pose a threat. So how does real estate fit in? Well, I think we can start off by having a look at some key stats. The building and building construction sectors account for 40% of global carbon emissions and over 1/3 of energy consumption. This is a really well-known stat, but I think it's really important to highlight. Perhaps what's less well known is that actually energy demand from buildings and building construction is still rising. And this is driven in part by a rapid increase in the number of buildings. And this growth is set to continue. So as is set to continue in the future. So global building stock is forecast to rise to double by 2050 as more people will be living in cities. So this really is a challenge as we see more buildings being built. Energy and emissions are still rising, and we've got to find a way to change this. And given these stats and the fact that 40% figure is so high, a focus on real estate and how we're decreasing emissions is inevitable. And really, there are two key drivers for the industry to embrace sustainability and progress towards those net zero targets. Firstly, we have the risks associated with climate change and their associated costs. We've just talked about some of the physical risks, which can be significant, both in terms of economic costs and other costs, but there are also two other risks to be aware of. Firstly, we have transitional risks, which occur in a move towards a greener economy. So for real estate, this can translate into green credentials of buildings. Demand is likely to be focused on the most sustainable assets, which means that they'll be easier to sell and easier to lease, while actually buildings that don't meet those standards could well become stranded assets. And the other type of risk is liability risk. And this can occur when we ask the question about who we hold responsible. So the role of accurate reporting here is vital. But it's not just risk, there's also the reward, because owning and building or renting sustainable assets can improve a company's reputation and have financial benefits, especially given the government support for this sector. Now, there's a lot of discussion around the environmental aspects, as I mentioned, of ESG, but the social and governance part of the acronym are equally important. So what do these mean for real estate? In simple terms, social includes factors such as the impact of assets on occupiers and their communities, how technologies are changing, how we live and work, and what role real estate plays in meeting the requirements of the changing socio-demographics. The G is governance and includes things such as culture, diversity, and conduct. And if we have a look at the Middle East, the governments here are really focused on growing sustainably. And this is being ensured through both regulatory guidelines and also development initiatives. And we're going to hear more about these from our panel of experts. So I'm now going to ask our panelists to turn on their cameras. And I'd just like to remind the audience that you can submit any questions you have in the Q&A box below. Great, thank you all for joining me. I just want to start off by asking you each to introduce yourself and sort of a little bit about your company as well. If you could do that very briefly, perhaps Nadima, I could start with you.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Nadima Mehra, and I'm the Vice President of the Transition Unit District 2020, which is the future development of Expo 2020 Dubai. I've been with Expo for over 6 years now, and I focus on what's going to happen with the site once the event is over.
Thank you. And Kez, if I could come to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. Pleasure to be with you here today. Qaisar Swedi, Director of Climate Change at the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment. The department here at the Ministry oversees both domestic and international climate policy here in the UAE, including climate mitigation, adaptation, as well as support for climate sciences and knowledge building that is related to climate policy development.
Thank you. Rob?
Thanks, Sophie. Rob Devereaux, the CEO of ICD Brookfield. ICD Brookfield is a powerful joint venture between Brookfield, who are a global alternative asset manager, with over $625 billion of assets under management, of which $220 billion of that is real estate related. Our partner, the Investment Corporation of Dubai, is essentially the sovereign wealth fund of Dubai, and they own and manage key assets such as Emirates Airlines, Donata, Fly Dubai, EMBD, amongst others. Together, we have developed a commercial and retail project in the DIFC, the Dubai Financial Center, which is basically a 1.5 million square foot regional benchmark in the market.
Thank you. And Ehtissam?
Thank you, Sophie. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ehtissam Farouk. I'm an associate director at the Red Sea Development Company, which is one of the giga projects recently announced by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in order to fulfill and achieve the Vision 2030. So we're responsible mainly to develop one of the luxury destinations in the world within the Red Sea coast of Saudi Arabia.
And last but not least, Dan?
Thank you, Sophie, and it's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. My name's Dan Gestico. I'm a director within the Savills Earth team here at Savills in the UK. I specialise in sustainable design of buildings, master plans, and help developers and architects achieve their net zero visions on both a building and a master plan scale. The Savills Earth team is a dedicated team within Savills of over 80 individuals specialising in sustainability of development, of construction, but also in operation as well. So we span the whole property life cycle from design right through to operation and end of life.
Great. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. I think a bit like the presentation earlier, if we're having a look at the whole of ESG, E is definitely the place to start with this, and it is a huge topic. But I think a really good way of kicking this off is to have a look at policy. So Kez, if I could come to you and ask how UAE's policy has changed regarding climate change, and what do you see happening in the future?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Sophie, and thank you again for the great presentation. I think if we can start with your presentation and the E and E for emissions, of course, as well, E for the environment, but emissions, which is, the main issue that everyone's talking about. Of course, we're talking about emissions that are related to climate change, greenhouse gases, but then as well as so both, say, domestic or internal in the indoor air quality as well as the outdoor air quality. And of course, the building sector is an important contributor to the global emissions, but it's also where we live and where we stay most of our time. And so indoor air quality becomes also important. So it's more than, so it's not just about the environment, of course. It's at the end of the day, it's about our health, it's about human health. And in addition to that, of course, talking about the global drive towards net zero, reducing our global emissions significantly to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, to avoid climate change altogether, but then at least work our way to at least mitigate those impacts. And with that comes adaptation. Of course, the building sector, the real estate industry has to be climate resilient, both in terms of reducing emissions, and that you talked about all the risks that are related to the transition, but as well as that to be resilient to the future impacts of climate change, especially when talking about coastal infrastructure, coastal developments. So that's also something that the industry will have to keep in mind. So coming back to your question, that was part of the answer, of course. But when it comes to climate policy here in the UAE, back in 2016, just after the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2016, the UAE created the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment. So the issue of climate change, and we have a cabinet level, ministry. So the climate change issue was recognized as a main policy issue that the UAE has to tackle, both domestically and internationally. And just after that, in 2017, the UAE cabinet approved the climate change plan, 2017-2050, which has three main pillars. One is, of course, mitigation, reducing emissions. The other one is adaptation, dealing with the climate risks. The third is looking for the opportunities and seizing those opportunities that come with the domestic and global drive towards mitigating climate change. And then with progress, so that's a key milestone, I'd say. Other milestones include the clean energy efforts, both nuclear and renewable energy, which are also part of the solution for the real estate industry. Because at the end of the day, given especially in our region where heat is extreme, and it's going to be even more extreme in the future with climate change, you need more cooling and you need more sustainable cooling. And a lot of the energy, at least 50%, goes into cooling. So you need sustainable sources of electricity for that cooling, as well as sustainable ways of cooling. So mitigation, adaptation, and then at the end of the last thing, maybe an important milestone, I don't want to take a long time here, is the second NDC of the UAE, where the UAE pledged to reduce its emissions 25% from business as usual by 2030. And of course, the building industry, the real estate sector is an important part of that effort.
Really interesting, thank you. And perhaps we can sort of think about how this applies in some sort of practical examples. So Nadima, coming to you, how is Expo and District 2020 advancing sustainability principles through the built environment as an urban community?
Sure, thank you. So as you know, the theme of the Expo itself is connecting minds, creating the future. And our sub-themes are sustainability, opportunity, and mobility. So we have a big focus during the 6-month Expo on sustainability. And we've encouraged global interaction around that within the Expo itself. And people visiting the Expo will see how countries are tackling challenges and opportunities to become more sustainable across many different verticals. How that translates into District 2020 is that, the first case in point is when we won the bid to host the World Expo, immediately thought was given to how we are going to repurpose the site. So that itself is a key player in how the Expo mindset is to be and create more sustainable projects. So 80% of everything that has been built for the Expo will be repurposed into District 2020. And alongside that, all the buildings that have been built by the host nation, which is the UAE and Dubai, are all LEED Platinum and Gold. And we inherit that for District 2020. So as a master developer, we get to inherit this incredible infrastructure that is already top of mind with regards to sustainability. We also, the site itself received glowing recognition from Sequel, becoming the first project in the Middle East to rate excellent. So we're very proud of that as well. And then so we took a look at that and we said, okay, so we have these LEED buildings and LEED Gold, LEED Platinum. So the Sustainability Pavilion, for example, Terra, is a LEED Platinum building and is 100% off the grid. And all of the buildings that we've built that will transition into residential and commercial buildings are all fitted with permanent solar panels and clean energy systems. We have smart monitoring systems that are already in place for the event that we will retain post-Expo as well. So that smart metering, smart monitoring, et cetera, will all be retained and repurposed in District 2020, which is the future development, the future mixed-use development of Expo 2020 Dubai. And I think those are key components. The other thing is, when you talk about an urban community, you talk that word community, I think, is critical. And one of the things that we tackled head on, I think it's been 3 or 4 years we've been in discussions with them, is how to ensure that District 2020 is a well-certified community. So just like how the buildings are LEED and Gold certified, we want to make sure that the community itself is well certified and speaks to the people living, working, and exploring in that space.
Great. Sounds fascinating. And thinking about sort of another practical example, Rob, if I could come to you and ask what sustainability considerations were taken into account for ICD Brookfield Place.
Sure, thanks, Sophie. So I think you mentioned at the beginning of your introduction that buildings are essentially responsible for 40% of global carbon emissions. So it's very important that owners take on sustainable development, and we at the outset decided to target LEED Platinum rating for ICD Brookfield Place. For those that don't know, LEED Platinum is essentially a global benchmark, and it's the highest rating that can be given by the US Green Building Council. And it's important for owners and developers to align with a globally recognized system so that you can work towards a ranking and a rating. And really the biggest factor in achieving a LEED Platinum is the energy consumption that a building uses during its life cycle. And the biggest component for us was actually choosing a very high grade glass or glazing, which has the biggest impact on the energy consumption, reducing the amount of energy required to cool the building because it doesn't allow the heat in the first place. And then obviously the selection of mechanical and electrical equipment. And again, there've been huge advances in that area over time. So, with a new building, we were able to select the latest and the greatest to ensure that our energy model was optimized and we consume very little energy. We also undertook to recycle over 87% of waste during construction. 30% of the construction materials were from recycled sources. So again, playing into that sustainable construction. We also undertook to use 48% less water than the industry baseline. And we have over 140,000 square feet of landscape space within the development, and we undertook to basically capture the condensate from the fan coil units and reuse that water for the irrigation. So we don't use any water off the grid for our landscaping space. Then, big part of it is obviously the social component as well to buildings, and that's not actually within the LEED Platinum ranking, but placemaking is very important to Brookfield, and we recognize that we want to create buildings that people want to be in. So we have 90% of the building has access to natural light. We have 30% over the ASHRAE standard for fresh air being a huge component to occupiers' well-being. We recently tested the indoor air quality, and we were actually 80% better than local and international air quality standards. We have, as I mentioned, over 4 acres of green space within the development. So, there's plenty of opportunity to not only work in the office, but to break out and be part of the landscape environment. We have an extensive arts and events program, to again provide that social element of a place where people want to be. And we recently opened a community hub called The Niche, which again we've made available to anybody who's in the vicinity to either sit and work, or we run again an events program within that of meditation, well-being, motivational speakers. So it's really an all-encompassing approach.
Sounds like a great place to be. Thank you. So it just sort of perhaps going slightly broader and coming to you, Dan. I know you're obviously based in the UK, but you've done another number of projects around the world, including in the Middle East. And I just wanted to ask your opinion on how you ensure that the sustainability targets set out at the start of the project are actually delivered in practice.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. So yeah, it's a really good one. What we're very good at as in terms of the development industry is making great promises about the sustainability of our development. We make bold claims about energy usage. We make bold claims about water usage. And then what we what we often fail to do is follow that up and actually measure it in practice. So to make sure that our sustainability credentials are upheld, that we're keeping our promises, we need to continuously monitor and record our progress against our targets. And if we're not achieving those targets, we need to be open about why we're not doing that and share those lessons learned, because basically coming at this from a sort of scientific and engineering background, you know, the whole point of experimentation and investigation is that you learn from what you're doing. So if we're not learning from what we're doing, from our designs, then we're going to keep making the same mistakes time and time again. And what we need to do is have a robust framework and mechanism to basically say, here is our design targets, here is what we're measuring, and here is how we're adapting those results to improve in future, not just within the building and the master plan that we're currently working on, but also for future projects, because it's that process of continuous improvement that's really going to help us tackle the net zero carbon challenge. And it'll also help to build trust in communities. I mean, so often sustainability features have been value engineered out or seen as being superfluous. That's now changing, thankfully, and people are now taking the issue more seriously. But actually, one of the best ways of kind of building trust with the community is to set out your sustainability credentials, your promises at the start of the project, and then make sure you follow through on them through the design, construction, handover, and operational phases to say that, look, we've actually delivered on this. And it's that kind of ongoing engagement and feedback that helps to kind of build that trust and closes that feedback loop and helps us learn from our own projects.
Great, thank you. And then I wanted to touch a little bit more on the risk that I mentioned earlier. So Etisam, perhaps you could tell us a bit about how climate change factors into the risk assessment at the Red Sea Development Company. Oh, I do think you just need to unmute yourself.
Apologies. Firstly, I think it's great to hear what great initiatives the rest of the participants on this panel are doing, whether from the District 20 and also from Brookfield. It really shows that us at Red Sea Development Company are following, you know, the trends that are, you know, happening around the world as well. So just touching on the risk assessment piece, from the very beginning, the Red Sea Development Company envisioned a project that would change everything. What we did at the Red Sea Development Company, we sought to go beyond the current understanding of what it actually means to be sustainable. We decided to choose a regenerative approach, which represented a transformation of how we think about tourism, the local economy, what does success mean for us, and also what do we mean by return on investments. So at TRSDC, we believe that the best way to protect and enhance nature is by becoming part of nature. So by putting natural capital at the forefront of everything that we do, our project has become a climate change mitigation and adaptation instrument. Hence, climate change risk mitigation, climate change related risks are mitigated by the way in which we design, construct, and also right through the way we will operate our destination. This is also reflected in the way in which we've adopted the same principles that were inspired by the newly introduced UN framework on the system of economic and environmental accounting. And again, what this framework shows is it really highlights the importance of what ecosystems represent and deliver to the benefit of wider society. So, for example, from a risk perspective at the Red Sea Development Company, we've adopted, we look at both transitional risks. So these are risks related to market, legal, technology changes, and how climate changes have an impact on these, as well as physical risk as well. So these are events that, can have an impact that are event driven, such as, increased levels of hurricanes, cyclones, etc. So all of these are looked at across our whole value chain, right from delivery through to operations. And we also have both qualitative and quantitative measures at looking at this. So qualitative measures involve looking at them in line with our board approved risk appetite statements, our key risk indicators, as well as our operational risk indicators. And on a quantitative basis, we look at how such we look at these on a monthly basis by undertaking a quantitative cost risk analysis, or as well as a quantitative schedule risk analysis as well. So putting all this together really shows the importance that we at the Red Sea Development Company are assigning to climate change, and just how my peers have mentioned in previous discussions, is the point about LEED as well, where we've just recently completed the first stage of being LEED certified for our destination plans and designs. And as well as that, what I'd also like to highlight is TRCC is proud of the fact that we're one of the first developers to being certified for our risk management processes. So we follow our ISO 31000 for our risk management processes, and we were one of the first developers in the kingdom. So again, highlighting the importance that we at Red Sea attach to climate change.
Great, thank you. And just finishing off on climate change, if I could come back to you, Kez, and just sort of ask if you see any more policy changes happening regarding climate change that will impact the real estate industry in UAE going forward.
Well, it's a good question. Thank you, Sophie. And now, in terms of the move towards lower emission sort of practices, and then mainstreaming. So we hear a lot of initiatives here and actions that are happening that are somehow still on the fringes. We need to mainstream these measures to become the practices of the small, medium, as well as the large developers. So large developers tend to have some the privilege, of taking into considerations these different practices, and also they have the responsibility, of course, being large and partially also government owned, especially in this region, of showing the way, doing the work for the smaller developers to actually follow that path. So the practices of the big developers here in the country are also part of the policy solution we have in the UAE, given the government sort of control these companies have. But then at the same time, this remains a challenge. The real estate industry remains, I think the construction industry in general remains a difficult industry to mitigate, especially when you talk about the whole supply chain, and then at the same time, again, being in this region, thinking about desalinating water, for example, and then also the energy sources you use, and then the amount of water and electricity you need for people to be able to live in these developments. These remain challenges, and these challenges the government understands and is working with the major players, with all players in the industry, to work together to address. But then at the same time, we're trying to take more of a bottom-up approach, more of a soft approach in terms of getting there, given the amount of challenges we have, and still at the same time the risks that might be associated with rapid sort of movement, given again the developing nature of this part of the world. So the costs, the benefits, and all these things need to be taken into account. So we're getting there together, hand in hand with our industry, and we can't go faster than the industry, but a lot of the responsibility lies, I think, with the industry.
Great, it definitely is a challenge everywhere. So I think let's move on now and look at the S, so social. And Dan, coming to you, how important is community engagement in achieving a sustainable development?
It's a really key issue, because we spend a lot of time talking about kilograms of carbon, kilowatt hours, litres of water, and all these wonderful things, but actually we forget that people are going to be inhabiting our buildings, and our buildings and developments are going to be built around existing communities. So getting their feedback is absolutely critical in building support and building a sustainable community. I mean, there's some quite shocking statistics here in the UK that only 2% of the general public trust developers to do the right thing by communities, which is terrible. And we need to rebuild that trust. And the one way of doing that is to bring local communities on the journey with us. So it means talking to them about what their local needs are, talking to new and existing residents about what they want to see coming out of the ground, the types of green space, leisure offerings, workplaces, that sort of thing, and actually delivering on that side of things. Because if you kind of have a development which doesn't do that, then it doesn't matter how green it is. If people don't like it, then it's not going to stand the test of time. So it's vitally important to build that community support, because these, with neighbouring communities, their lives are going to be disrupted by construction, no matter how much we try and mitigate it. So actually demonstrating tangible benefits that will result to their lives post-development is really, really important, and delivering on that really helps to build that social element of the ESG portfolio.
Great. And Nadima, I was really interested to hear District 2020 described as a human-centric city. What exactly does this mean?
Yeah, I think just going back to what Dan said, it's really important that when you use the word community, you actually deliver on a community, and it's not what you think a community should be, it's what people really want, and you need to engage with them. So one of the things, we did a lot of analysis when we were determining what types of buildings we were going to build, because as I said, we were working hand in glove with the real estate team when we were first building the buildings for the Expo, into what type of public realm do people want nowadays? What are they looking for? That sense of community, what is it? What does it mean to them? So we looked at that, and we've built a public realm that engages the community to come together. Our commercial ecosystem is centered around the ability to collaborate with one another. And so that means that the buildings need to be human scale. They need to allow for ease of interaction. They don't want large spaces anymore, sprawling buildings. They want that sense of community, which is what we think we've delivered at the Expo and District. And the other thing that we look at is the resilience factors. So, we keep saying future proofing and what that looks like. And as our technology starts to play a bigger role in how sustainable we are and how connected we can make the community, we need to ensure our technology is enabled to allow for that resilience to happen. So that's something that, again, we've ensured that we are 5G enabled. We've got very strong Internet of Things across the site. So it enables all of that to communicate, to create that smart city, which will ensure that people live that lifestyle that they want. We've got 10 kilometers of bike paths. We have 46,000 square meters of park space that's already built. We've got 5-kilometer running tracks that are already in place. So looking at those things and ensuring that there's a balance, a balance between work and life. And then naturally, since we are the Expo, we have a lot of cultural elements that will remain from the Expo that people will be able to be, they're going to be able to live next to a museum and walk across the street and go see the latest art gallery that's come up. So it is truly an integrated community which we've built.
Thank you. I think the other phrase that really caught my attention was one from you, Rob, and that is breaking the plastic habit. It's definitely something I'd like to do. I think a lot of us struggle with this. How does that work, and what has the response been?
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, so I think we're all aware just how much plastic is a global pandemic in itself, and the impact that it's having on our environment. Our colleagues from Brookfield Properties at Canary Wharf in London actually launched Break the Plastic Habit very successfully over what is a large community of occupiers, residents, retailers. And it was very successful in that it was well received by the community and also by the residents themselves. Essentially, it's not about removing all plastic. It's about targeting avoidable single-use plastic items and continued education, influencing a positive behavioral change to people, really. And so it's about community engagement, and we have engaged environmental experts who actually have sessions with our tenants and occupiers, and do an audit of their daily lives, if you like, and educate where they can remove single-use plastic items. For example, sanitizer that we all use. So during this COVID pandemic, you can have it in a glass bottle rather than in a plastic bottle. Removing all water plastic bottles out of the work environment, really creating a continued awareness and education. We've installed a water dispenser in our community space, the niche, that is available for people to refill reusable water bottles. And we have continued educational programs within the niche, which provide the occupiers advice on how to reduce plastic within the environment. So it's really a continued program rather than a silver bullet that's going to end it, but it's continued education.
Thank you. I think it's really important that we understand how much of an influence the real estate industry can have, everything from plastic to energy consumption. So my final question before we move on to take a couple of questions that have come through from our audience is to Etissam, and we want to address the G and understand why is governance important and how does it complement the E and the S? And perhaps you could also tell us a little bit about how governance is implemented at the Red Sea Development Company.
Perfect. So I think what's important to note is that governance is extremely important both to the E and the S. You cannot achieve one or the other without governance. It's often usually the crucial component in ensuring that both the environmental and social material topics of an organizations are effectively managed. So by developing and designing internal governance systems really allows organizations to monitor their ESG objectives and also as well as to achieve those objectives as well. I'm just going to touch upon a point that Dan made earlier in the session was organizations do make a number of commitments, but how do we convey these commitments or achievements or areas of improvement to the public? And that's something that we at Red Sea are really proud of, as well as building a groundbreaking tourist destination. We're also setting new standards when it comes to governance. We want to be one of the entities that reports in the most accountable, transparent manner. So one of the examples that we've had at TRCC is that we recently published our first annual sustainability report. This again just links into one of the principles that we've aligned ourselves with, is to be transparent as possible, to show what we've achieved throughout the years since we started developing the project, what are the areas of improvement, and report year on year to show what achievements we've made, and where we do have if we do have any shortfalls, how we can overcome these as well. So in terms of the governance structure, I say we really need a robust governance system for all organizations. Now, for example, at the Red Sea, we've developed a very ambitious internal controls toolkit, which is based on the COSO model, which really takes an organization through the different maturity stages of an entity, right from inception all the way through to operations. And this is a toolkit that we've set for ourselves. And it's also being rolled out across other giga projects within the kingdom as well to develop. In terms of internally as well, what we've done is we have our internal code of conduct, which we expect all our employees to sign up to, which it sets out all the ethical and legal behaviors that we expect of them. But as well as internally, we've also extended this to our suppliers. So we've also asked all our suppliers that we work with to sign up to our supplier code of conduct, which sets out the values that we as TRCC prescribe and aspire to achieve. So all the way from protecting or respecting human rights, right to the prohibition of anti-bribery, corruption, etc. So in terms of leadership as well, we really moved away from the standard traditional framework of principal agency theory, and really taking in that stakeholder-based approach as well, where we are looking into taking into considerations of local communities, our suppliers, our vendors, and customers as well. So from a governance perspective, I think it's very crucial that organizations have the right structures and frameworks in place in order to achieve their ESG outcomes and objectives.
Thank you. Well, we're running short on time. I could definitely go on and talk about this for hours. It's been really fascinating, but I think we'll just take one or two questions that have come through from the audience, and just if I could ask you to keep your answers brief. Dan, I'm actually going to come to you for the first one. We've been asked what technology or solutions are available to owners of existing assets to measure and improve their ESG footprint, which the person who's asked the question sees as very challenging compared to those that are building from new.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a tricky one because you can't quantify all elements of an ESG portfolio, of an ESG strategy. Some elements, such as community engagement activities, are qualitative. So it's very difficult to put a number against all of these sorts of elements. But by and large, a lot of the governance stuff is wrapped up in policies, as many of the other panelists have sort of said. But for existing buildings, I guess what the key to it is basically about monitoring and measuring. It's fairly dry in that it comes down to a lot of data collection, but the old adage goes, you can't manage what you don't measure. So if you want to achieve a credible net zero carbon pathway, you need to start collecting data through metering, through monitoring, and then start acting on that data to create a net zero carbon pathway for existing assets. So that will typically consist of decarbonising your fuel supply, getting rid of any gas installations, and replacing it with something that's electricity based, because obviously that can be decarbonised a lot easier than gas can. So it's about collecting data, working out your net zero carbon pathways, and then substituting in renewable technologies or renewable compatible technologies.
Great. I think unfortunately that is all we have time for on this webinar, but I'm very sorry to those who have put in questions from our audience. We will get back to you and let you know our answers to those. I would just like to thank everyone for participating in this panel. It's been really fascinating to hear your answers. I've really enjoyed it, and everyone who's joined us, we will be sending a link to the report that was mentioned earlier, and also a recording of this webinar as well. So thank you very much, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.